August 8, 1942. Königsberg, East Prussia. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oil and sweat. Deep underground, beneath layers of steel and concrete, a German signal bunker throbbed with the hum of machines and the quiet dread of men who listened to ghosts on the airwaves. Dust trembled in the orange light of electric lamps, and the steady rhythm of Morse code filled the room like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Lieutenant Otto Weiss leaned over the receiver, his headphones pressed tight, eyes fixed on the flickering green glow of the decoding screen. He had been listening for 18 hours straight. His fingers trembled as he traced the dots and dashes, each one like a pulse of the unseen enemy breathing through static. The Eastern Front stretched hundreds of miles away, but here in this dim room, the war was fought in whispers, through wires, signals, and fear. A sudden burst of static jolted through the speakers. Then came a faint voice, urgent, broken by interference. Weiss straightened. The transmission was Russian, low-band, military grade. He began to copy it down, his pencil moving faster than his thoughts. The voice was trembling. The code header, it matched something he hadn't seen in months, Stalin's personal cipher prefix. His breath caught. He double-checked the signature. It was unmistakable. The room fell silent except for the whine of the machines. The men around him exchanged nervous looks. Weiss swallowed hard, then began to translate. The message read, "All units to prepare for full defensive retreat east of the Volga. Destroy infrastructure. No prisoners." A murmur spread through the bunker. A retreat order. From Stalin himself. If true, it meant only one thing. The Soviet line was collapsing. But the front reports didn't match this. The Red Army was battered but still fighting tooth and nail around Stalingrad. Why would Stalin call for a retreat? Why now? Weiss looked again at the message, as if staring at it long enough could change the meaning. His instinct screamed that something wasn't right. But instinct wasn't evidence. And in intelligence work, instinct could get men killed. He gathered the papers, sealed them in a coded envelope, and dispatched a courier straight to Berlin. The hours crawled by as the bunker settled back into uneasy silence. Weiss leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, listening to the faint buzz of electricity. He could almost hear the war breathing beyond the walls, the artillery, the distant cries, the thud of trucks carrying supplies eastward. But beneath it all, he sensed something darker. The message had felt off. The rhythm of the Morse spacing, the hesitation in the operator's tone. It was as if someone had been forced to send it. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon. The night smelled of rain and gasoline. Somewhere above ground, trains rumbled toward the east, carrying ammunition and men who didn't yet know how close they were to the edge of something catastrophic. Berlin responded within 6 hours. The decoded transmission was forwarded directly to the Abwehr headquarters. General Reinhard Gehlen himself read it under dim light, his cigarette trembling between two fingers. His eyes moved slowly, line by line, until the final words froze him in place. A Soviet collapse? It seemed impossible, yet this was no ordinary communication. It bore Stalin's mark. He summoned his staff. Orders flew across the room. Reconnaissance divisions were alerted, analysts cross-referenced every Soviet frequency. And still, the same chilling conclusion remained. Stalin's command was genuine. And yet, the timing was absurd. German divisions were locked in brutal combat near Stalingrad. Soviet resistance was fierce, stubborn, even suicidal. There was no sign of panic on the ground. Something wasn't adding up. In the bunker at Königsberg, Weiss couldn't sleep. The whirring machines echoed through his head like a prayer he couldn't escape. He opened his journal and began to write, not as a soldier, but as a man who felt a storm was coming. "If this message is true," he wrote, "then the East is already lost. But if it is false, then we are walking into a trap." He looked up at the radio, its dials glowing faintly. The world outside was silent now, the rain washing over the city like ash. The war had taught him one thing, that truth was a weapon, and in the wrong hands, it could kill more men than bullets. Then, just before dawn, another transmission came through. The operator shouted for him. Weiss bolted upright, nearly spilling his coffee. The signal was stronger this time, clear, deliberate, carrying Stalin's cipher once again. He stared at the printout as the Morse operator finished. The message read, "Retreat order is false. Enemy deception suspected. Hold positions at all costs. Prepare counteroffensive." The room fell dead silent. Weiss felt his chest tighten. Two messages, both bearing Stalin's seal, one ordering retreat, the other demanding to stand and fight. Which one was real? He gathered the papers again, his hands trembling. The second message used a frequency usually reserved for decoy transmissions. It was almost too perfect. Someone was trying to cover something, or someone had panicked. Hours later, Berlin received both messages. Confusion spread through the intelligence channels like wildfire. Reports clashed, orders were delayed. One division was redirected based on the first transmission, another based on the second. The front lines trembled under the weight of uncertainty. General Gellin stared at the two conflicting orders. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he set his cigarette down and whispered to no one in particular. One of these came from a frightened man. He ordered radio silence. No further transmissions to or from the Königsberg station. No public analysis. The file was to remain classified until further review. Weiss received the order, uneasy but obedient. In the following hours, the bunker returned to its restless rhythm. Static filled the air again, but something had changed. The men listened differently now, cautious, skeptical, aware that the air itself might be lying to them. And through it all, Otto Weiss couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a crack in the enemy's armor, or a hole in his own. He stared once more at the coded sheets before sealing them for the last time. The faint ink lines looked like veins, fragile, full of life, carrying truths that could end nations. He whispered under his breath, "What if both are real?" Then he turned off the lamp, leaving the room in shadow. The war moved on, but the questions lingered. Somewhere in the endless silence between frequencies, a single thought remained. The enemy's greatest weapon wasn't the gun, the tank, or the bomb. It was the message you believed. And far to the east, under the smoke of Stalingrad, men were dying for the meanings behind those words. To every soldier, every listener, and every viewer across the world, if you're hearing this story from WW2 Frontline Legends, subscribe and join the ranks. Let us know where you're watching from. The frontline stretches across continents, but history unites us all. Because what happens next changes everything. Berlin was restless that month. The heat pressed down on the city like a punishment, and in the upper floors of the Abwehr headquarters, the air stank of sweat, ink, and anxiety. Intelligence officers shuffled through papers, their faces gray from sleepless nights. Somewhere deep inside that maze of smoke and teletypes, General Reinhard Gellin sat alone at his desk, reading the two intercepted Soviet messages again and again. The first, ordering retreat east of the Volga. The second, commanding the Red Army to hold and counterattack. Each bore Stalin's encryption signature. Each had come from a different Soviet relay point. Neither could be dismissed. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. If the first message was authentic, the Red Army was fracturing, a once-in-a-century intelligence breakthrough. But if it was false, then the Germans were being led into a trap designed to consume them in the Russian steppe. Down in Königsberg, Lieutenant Otto Weiss waited for orders. The radio operators kept scanning, searching for new Soviet traffic. But the air was eerily quiet, too quiet. It was as if the enemy had simply stopped talking. Weiss had learned long ago that silence was never peace. It was usually preparation. He began to re-examine the logs. The timing of the first message, the pauses between Morse symbols, the irregular beat. Something about it gnawed at him. He compared it to previous Soviet transmissions, all of them steady, precise, efficient. But this one had stuttered. Twice. A tiny pause, inconsistent with trained operators. Weiss's pencil tapped against the desk. Then he froze. There it was again, the spacing. A delay pattern that matched the profile of a forced transmission. Soviet intelligence often compelled captured radio men to send false orders under threat of death. The rhythm of fear was unmistakable. He ran to the communications chief. "Look at this spacing," he said, pointing to the log sheets. The operator hesitated, not once, but twice. "That's duress coding. This message could have been sent by someone held at gunpoint." The chief frowned, unsure. "And the second one?" Weiss hesitated. The second message was clean. Too clean. Every pulse, every dot, perfectly spaced, as if composed by a machine rather than a man. Back in Berlin, General Gellin received Weiss's report. His jaw tightened. It made sense, disturbingly so. If the Soviets knew their line was penetrated, they might stage transmissions to mislead the Germans. Still, something felt off. He ordered reconnaissance squadrons to verify movements near the Volga. For 3 days, the Luftwaffe scouted the area. Nothing. No mass retreat, no abandoned infrastructure. Instead, Soviet convoys moved toward the front, not away from it. The Abwehr began to lean toward one conclusion. The first message was disinformation. And so, the deception began to spread. German divisions adjusted their positions eastward, hoping to capitalize on a collapsing enemy. Engineers rerouted supply lines. Commanders planned assaults under the assumption that the Red Army was retreating. But Otto Weiss couldn't rest. He spent nights listening to the static, tracing the war through sound alone. Every hiss, every flicker, every faint heartbeat of code across the wires carried truth and deceit intertwined. Late one evening, as rain lashed against the bunker windows, another signal broke through, faint, fractured, almost drowned by interference. It wasn't from Moscow or Stalingrad this time, but from somewhere near Kursk. It was brief, no more than a few words, and then silence. Weiss barely caught it before it vanished. The first message was real. He stared at the receiver, heart pounding. Could it be a Soviet officer gone rogue? A coded confession? Or perhaps an echo from the same captured operator before his execution? The possibilities tangled in his mind like wires. He sent the transcription to Berlin immediately, but no acknowledgement came. The network had gone silent again. In Berlin, Gehlen had problems of his own. Hitler's staff demanded results, proof that Stalin's command structure was crumbling. Reports of Soviet retreat were good propaganda, morale fuel for the public and the front. The Reich Ministry seized on the story. Newspapers hinted that the Red Army was faltering. But inside the intelligence halls, men whispered otherwise. If this was a Soviet trap, they were walking into the jaws of a beast that never slept. Days passed. Then, out of nowhere, a message arrived from the Eastern Intercept Station at Pskov. A new Soviet code string had been partially decrypted, and it referenced August 8th, the same day as the panic order. The translation read simply, "Signal from Station Volga invalid. Operator compromised. Action terminated." Weiss's blood ran cold. Operator compromised. That meant one thing, execution. Whoever had sent the first message was dead. He now understood the rhythm in that Morse code. Those brief pauses weren't hesitation. They were silent cries for help. He couldn't tell Berlin that. Not anymore. The narrative was already set in motion. German divisions were shifting east. The propaganda machine had spun the story into proof of victory. To challenge it was to question the entire chain of command. Weiss returned to his post, feeling the weight of silence pressing down. Around him, the machines ticked on, the lifeless pulse of a world drowning in deception. One night, as he adjusted the receiver, he heard something unusual on the frequency band, faint music. A Soviet folk tune, slow and haunting, playing from somewhere across the line. He recognized it instantly. The Soviets sometimes used melodies as markers for special transmissions. But this one wasn't coded. It was almost mournful. He listened as the song faded into static. Then, in the background, he thought he heard a whisper in Russian, barely audible, just one word, "Forgive." He removed his headphones, pale and shaken. Was it an accident? A ghost signal? Or something more human? A trace of guilt bleeding through the chaos of war? The next morning, Berlin sent out a new directive. Continue monitoring all Soviet frequencies. Report only confirmed orders. All anomalies to be archived without analysis. In other words, stop looking too closely. But Otto Weiss couldn't stop. He began archiving the messages in secret, cataloging patterns, handwriting notes only he could decode. He wasn't sure what he was searching for, truth, redemption, or perhaps a way to make sense of the madness. By September, the German offensive eastward had intensified. Supplies ran thin, morale thinner. Reports from Stalingrad spoke of entire regiments swallowed by the city's ruins. And through it all, the Soviets did not retreat. They stood and fought. Weiss realized with a sinking heart that every move the Germans had made since August 8th had been built on a lie. A beautifully crafted illusion. The enemy hadn't fooled them with strength, but with fear. He wrote in his notebook that night, "We believed the message because we wanted to. That is the true genius of deception." But fate was not done with him yet. A courier arrived that same week carrying a sealed envelope, marked Top Secret, from Field Command 27. Inside were transcripts from a newly captured Soviet radio outpost. Among them, one phrase stood out, stamped with NKVD clearance. Order rescinded by chairman. Operator executed for unauthorized transmission. Weiss felt his breath catch. The first message had been real. Stalin had panicked. even if only for an hour. He stared at the document, the paper trembling in his hands. What kind of leader kills the man who reveals his fear? He didn't know then that this revelation would soon reach Berlin, and that it would change how Germany viewed Stalin forever. But the truth had come too late. The machine of war was already moving. The front was burning, men were dying, and behind every burst of static, the ghosts of August 8th whispered through the wires. The first snow arrived early that year, falling across the Eastern Front like pale ash. Frozen rivers and burnt forests marked the line between empires. Amid the smoke and the silence, whispers carried farther than bullets. By October, the Battle of Stalingrad had turned into a nightmare. Whole divisions were trapped in the ruins, the air thick with the stench of gunpowder and death. From his post in Königsberg, Lieutenant Otto Weiss listened night after night as Soviet frequencies filled with screams, coordinates, and silence. Yet among the chaos, something else began to emerge, faint new ciphers, cleaner than before, deliberate. It was as if someone had rebuilt Stalin's communication network from the ground up. Berlin had all but forgotten the August intercept. The Reich had moved on to more pressing matters: supply shortages, the tightening noose of the Russian winter, and Hitler's growing impatience. But for Weiss, the echoes of that day still lingered in every burst of static. He often replayed the old signal logs, tracing each mark on the paper, hearing the rhythm in his mind. The irregular pauses, the hesitation, the fear. That voice from August, the operator who had dared to transmit Stalin's retreat order, haunted him. Then, one frigid morning, a coded dispatch reached Königsberg. It was marked priority, Abwehr internal. Weiss opened it slowly, his hands stiff from the cold. Inside was a short note: incoming defector, NKVD unit. Secure transport to Berlin. Declassify no data until authorized. The man arrived under cover of darkness, gaunt, shivering, with eyes that had seen too much. His name was Alexei Gurevich, a Soviet radio officer once assigned to the NKVD's communications directorate. His defection had cost him everything. He was quiet at first, speaking through a translator, his voice little more than a whisper. But when Weiss showed him the intercepted August messages, Gurevich froze. He stared at the Morse transcripts as though looking at the handwriting of a dead friend. Then he said, it was real. Every word. The room fell silent. He went on to explain what had happened. In early August, false intelligence had reached Stalin suggesting that German panzer divisions were encircling Moscow again. In panic, Stalin had ordered a total fallback east of the Volga, a catastrophic command that would have undone months of defense planning. The message was sent through a relay in Astrakhan. But within hours, his advisors realized the report was false. Stalin rescinded the order, furious at the panic it might cause. The operator who transmitted it, a man named Pavel Novikov, was executed by pistol shot before dawn. His family was erased from the records. The NKVD then scrambled to send a second message, the one Weiss had intercepted 2 days later, declaring the first to be enemy deception. It was a desperate attempt to bury Stalin's moment of weakness under layers of disinformation. Weiss listened in silence. He had suspected a trap, but never this. What he'd witnessed wasn't just a ruse. It was a glimpse into the mind of a man who ruled by fear and silence. Berlin didn't believe it at first. The Abwehr analysts dismissed Gurevich's confession as propaganda. After all, how could Stalin, the so-called Iron Man, panic? But Gelin knew better. He had seen the tremor in history's hand before. He ordered the file sealed and stored in a classified archive labeled Operation Volga. Weeks later, as the battle for Stalingrad grew bloodier, Weiss received one final transmission. It wasn't from the Soviets. It was internal, from a source within Berlin's cryptologic division. A single sentence: the Führer will never know of Stalin's fear. The war had become a war of myths. Truth was too dangerous to survive. The snow thickened across the front. Weiss spent his nights at the receiver, headphones on, listening to the cold hum of an empire stretching into infinity. He often wondered if Stalin ever thought about that night, the night his fear had nearly broken the Soviet Union. Did he regret it? Did he even remember the man who died to conceal it? Far away, in Moscow, Stalin was reshaping the story. His propaganda ministers had turned the Stalingrad campaign into legend. The unshakable defense, the will of the people, the unwavering command of the Generalissimo. But deep inside the Kremlin archives, behind sealed doors and guarded shelves, one file bore a date and a single handwritten note in red ink. August 8, 1942, panic order rescinded. If the Germans knew how close we came, they would have never stopped at Stalingrad. No one outside those walls would see it for decades. Back in Königsberg, Otto Weiss's health had begun to fail. The long nights, the endless smoke, the weight of the war pressed heavy on him. But he never stopped listening. Even as the tide turned, even as the Red Army began to advance, he stayed at his post. Because somewhere in that static, he believed, lay the truth, the sound of men's souls under the pressure of history. Sometimes he would hear echoes of that August signal, faint and broken. Once, he swore he could hear a single Morse tap in the same pattern Novikov had used, short, long, the universal distress call. He never told anyone. When Berlin finally fell in 1945, much of the Abwehr's intelligence was destroyed. Files burned, records vanished, and men disappeared into captivity. Yet one small metal case, labeled Weiss Collection, survived. Inside were handwritten logs, audio spools, and one sealed envelope. On it, in Weiss's careful script, was written, "The day the steel trembled." That envelope would surface decades later in the archives of East Germany. Historians dismissed it as rumor, a clever piece of psychological warfare. But the handwriting matched. The date was real. The intercepted signal had existed. The world would never know whether Stalin's panic order truly reached every Soviet unit, or if it had been erased before its consequences took shape. The truth, like so many things in war, was buried under smoke and silence. Still, one thing remained certain. For a few terrible hours on August 8, 1942, the unbreakable will of Joseph Stalin had cracked, and the fate of millions hung in the balance. The camera of history might never have captured it, but the airwaves had. The sound of fear, hidden in dots and dashes, recorded in ink by a man who refused to stop listening. And maybe that was why, long after the war ended, the Soviet archives kept one file sealed longer than all the rest. Because it didn't just reveal Stalin's mistake. It revealed his humanity. The static fades. The machines fall silent. And as the last page turns, one line echoes through the cold corridors of time. If the Germans knew how close we came, they would have never stopped at Stalingrad. And so ends one of the most haunting secrets of the Second World War. A single night when the fate of nations trembled over the airwaves. If stories like this remind you that behind every headline lies a heartbeat, that courage and fear often share the same frequency, then subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Share this video with someone who loves history, who believes that truth still hides in the shadows of the past. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Because history doesn't just live in museums. It lives in all of us, in every listener across the front line. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, sometimes the greatest battles are fought in silence.